less than Hawker.
For family, I think. Oh.
But I'll try to keep everything up. I did teach a class over the weekend for a writers' conference. I taught a class in writing a novel. And it was really well received. I had a bunch of collegiate teachers, professors in the class, and they were like shaking their heads up and down. So
Oh.
they seemed to like that. But you know, that's a difficult subject. How do you tell people how to write a novel in such a way that makes sense and they can use the information? But I think I put it on YouTube too, so it's up there. And this will be on YouTube also. In any case, we're talking about the history of the Gospels, and we're up to literature. So this is what we've been looking at. The Gospels is Greek literature because it is Greek literature, right? It's a literary context and the basis for all modern literature, and you're going to find out why. I've already alluded to it, I've already talked about it a little bit, but I'll give you the full skinny on that today. We're looking at the Gospels as history. We put it in a historical context. That's what we did a couple of classes ago. We put it within a cultural context. That's what we did in the first class. And I explained to you it's the basis of Western civilization. So, you know, we've been through that. We're looking at the New Testament documents, but specifically the Gospels, in terms of history and literature. And that's the whole point, because, well, they're history and literature. And that's what we proved last week, right? The veracity of the text. In any case, here's where we are. We have to understand that when we talk about the literature of the Gospels, it's not the same kind of literature that we're used to in English. Because English literature, all literature, written literature, I guess all literature is written, but everything that's written down follows a pattern. Now, we don't like to think about that, or we don't think about that in terms of ancient cultures. We think those guys in ancient cultures are like children, right? They're not as smart as we are, they're not cogent of the world, they don't know what's going on. Well, they may not understand the world the way we do in a scientific frame of reference, what we call a rational Greek worldview, but they're not any less sophisticated than we are, than anyone is. It's just they're working in a different culture. And so what we have to realize is that Greek literature, likewise, is focused in a very intellectual sphere. Now, I'm going to mention this right now. We'll get to this and see what this means. But in general, and this is true of all ancient literature, not just Greek literature, but all ancient literature prior to the Gospels is either sayings or narratives. Now, what do I mean by that? If, for example, you look at Greek literature, you find Greek literature like the Socratic dialogues. What's a Socratic dialogue? Basically, it's sayings, people communicating in a dialogue, back and forth. It's all quotes of what they're saying. And therefore, very simply, we call those sayings. Now, they're not sayings in the sense that they're bumper stickers, okay? They're not sayings that, you know, like many times we take the words of the Gospels, the words of Christ, and we pull them out of context, and we try to say that that's a saying. Guess what? The Gospels are just like Greek dialogue literature. The dialogues of Socrates, for example. We find in almost all of the philosophical documents in the Greek lexicon are dialogues or sayings. There's also another type of literature in the ancient world called narratives. Narratives are, for example, Herodotus and Theodocles, where they don't have sayings, they don't quote people, they simply tell you what was going on. A narrative. Now, in the Old Testament, we have something similar, don't we? If you ever notice, there's a whole lot of parts, for example, in Isaiah, in Proverbs, in different places, and what do they have? They have whole chapters of separation where there are sayings, and then there's whole chapters of separation that are narratives. And except where we've gone in and kind of buggered with it a little bit, you don't find them mixed together. As a matter of fact, if you looked at the verb forms and tenses, you'd find that they're subjunctive verb forms, which means, like, for example, if I say, I said that, as opposed to I said, then with quotations. And in English, that's the way that we express something that was said but that it's not being used as a direct quote saying, I said that, it was said, it was uttered, as opposed to, I said, quotes, etc. So that broadly is the difference between sayings and narratives. And what we find in the ancient world is that in almost every case, now you'll find examples that don't exactly fit this case, but in almost every case, 99.9% of all cases, there is always a separation in ancient literature between sayings and narratives. They're not mixed together until the Gospels. Now, Greek is an argument to a telos. And what is that? I'll show you what that is. We'll get there. This is actually Greek parchment of the New Testament doctrine of the Gospels. The New Testament is 27 separate historical works. Each of them is Greek. They're each Greek. They are historical documents, and historical documents written in Greek, and therefore the language is critical. If anyone's tried to read it, now, there's less problem reading, for example, Alexander Dumas. But has anyone ever picked up a bad translation of Alexander Dumas? You know, the Three Musketeers? Has anyone read a bad translation? I have. There's terrible translations. How about a terrible translation of Dostoevsky? Matter of fact, I'm not happy with any of the Russian translations, because Russian is an Oriental language. Did you know that? Russian is an Oriental language, and it does not translate into English very well. It is more euphemistic than, for example, Greek, but it still does not translate well because it's Oriental. Greek is an Oriental language. It's a non-euphemistic, concrete language. We don't have that great a difficulty translating French to English, because did you know that about 50% of English is French in origin, right? Because of Norman the Conqueror, who came over in 1066 and brought the French language to England, right? And English is a compilation of Anglo-Saxon mixed with French. That's what English is. So it isn't that difficult. In German, because Anglo-Saxon is based in German, it's not that difficult. But when we start talking about Greek, which is an Oriental language, and a very concrete language, and then translating it into English, there are difficulties. And we've seen those difficulties. We'll see them even more in the Gospel, although I'm not going to get into quite the detail that I did before in some of the other classes. In any case, here's some of the words I want to give you today. Lego, analogia, dialogismos, telio, epitelio, bravion, and telos. We'll just see. The most important ones are lego and telos. Logos and telos. Lego and telos. A lego. Lego literally means to lay forth, to relate. And look what it says, usually of systematic or set discourse. Now, what this word really means in classical Greek is an argument, a discussion. Now, when we think of argument, we think about fighting, right? We're not talking about fighting. We're talking about an argument, as in laying out a discourse or argument in logic, for example. So when we say a Lego, what it is literally a systematic or set discourse. In other words, it is an attempt to determine the truth through a statement of logic, a logical argument. The problem with this word is it is translated in English as, generally I always say and said. Look at how it's translated. Ask, bid, boast, call, describe, give out, name, put forth, say, show, speak, tell, and utter. The problem is there are approximately 12 other words in Greek that can be translated say and said. Each of them have a specific different meaning than Lego, because a logos, a Lego, is specifically an argument. Antilogia, this is in a dispute. In other words, this is what we would call it. You notice in English we already have an interesting conundrum here, right? Because in Greek, if I want to tell you an argument that leads to a logical conclusion, I call it a Lego. If I want to tell you an argument that is a dispute, then I say it is antilogia. Do you see that? Isn't that neat? I already have two separate words. Of course, in English we could call it a dispute, we'd be more correct, but English has a million words. Greek does not. Dialogismos, this is a discussion, basically back and forth. Let me see, dialogismos. We don't really need to get into great detail. The one I really want to get to is teleos. Teleos. If you look at all these words, to complete, accomplish, consummate, teleos, to complete, etc. But the one I really want to hit, epitelio, to fulfill further. Brevion is an award, but I want to get to this with telos. This is from telo. We saw those. Literally to set out for a definite point or goal. Properly the point aimed at as a limit. Whoa! It means in the Greek a vanishing point on the horizon. Literally. It is specifically a geometric term. So, many times we translate this word, well, if you look what we translated here, telos is continual, custom, in, final, uttermost. But in reality, a telos is a vanishing point. That's a pretty big difference, isn't it? So when we say that something is a logos to telos argument, a logos to telos, a lego to a telos, what we're saying is that it is an argument that has some type of, well, we don't even say a conclusion. The word telos does not really mean a conclusion. It means that there is a vanishing point at which, what can you guess comes together at that vanishing point? That's right, all the argument or arguments that you've made come together at that point. We don't state the telos. The telos is self-evident, and we're going to talk about that. So in a Greek document, what you'll find is an argument, a lego, without any conclusion. They never state a conclusion, not in ancient Greek literature. That's why all those Socratic dialogues and all those philosophical dialogues that you were forced to read when you were in school always confused you. Because you were expecting some kind of conclusion, right? Did they ever give you one? Never gave you a conclusion. Matter of fact, if you're looking for conclusions, look at Roman documents. We'll talk about that too. Anyway, in the ancient world, the basic way of thinking is different. We've looked at this before, right? Religious thinking is different. Cultural thinking is different. The way they approach the world is different than the way we think. And generally, specifically, how you see the world is the way you write about the world. So we have to think about this. Generally, in the ancient world, it was focused on interpreting the world in terms of a pagan worldview. Spirits and gods make the world what it is. Fate, man is fated, etc., etc. And so, when we look at the ancient world, we're looking from a cultural worldview in a worldview that is very different than ours. Well, I hope it is anyway. Because we live in a Greek rational scientific worldview. So, we're looking at a time period when you have the Greeks moving into Greek rationalism. The Romans are basically Greek rationalists. Except the one thing that the Romans do better than the Greeks: applied technology. So the Greeks had great ideas, but they didn't build the aqueducts. The Romans built the aqueducts, right? The Greeks just took the time to kind of draw a couple of pictures and maybe do some philosophy. They thought it was a neat idea, but why expend the effort to do it, right? But in any case, you find that the Greek world, remember, the whole world is Hellenized. And guess who is running that world? The Romans. So we have a Greek Hellenized world that is under the Roman leadership. And the Romans are Hellenized, right? As a matter of fact, all their gods and goddesses all come from Greek molds. They just changed the name to protect the innocent. The Hebrew worldview is beginning to build thought patterns around Greek rationalism. Remember the Apocrypha? How we saw the Hellenization of the times, the Hellenization of the thinking. Guess what we find in the Gospels? The thinking is fully Hellenized. But what's happening at this period is the Hebraic world is basically trying